I recently just watched the final episode for The Walking Dead, a show that for a lot of us has been dead for a long time. The Walking Dead's been airing since 2010, and like a tumor, it has refused to end, even after years of bad ratings and drops in viewership. The show at its peak in 2016 and hasn't been the same since, and boys, there are a number of reasons why that's the case. Just take a look at this graph. They nearly lost 7 million viewers in just one season, and it just got worse from there. Seasons 7 and 8 were bad, but they were at least tolerable. The drop in viewers from season 8 to 9 isn't as extreme as you'd expect, but then again, it's not like they had that many viewers to lose in the first place. From 18 million to 5 is just depressing for a show as renowned as The Walking Dead. Thinking back on it though, it makes sense why there were at least some people watching during season 8. The ending to the war with Negan was supposed to be dramatic and powerful, as it tied off the biggest war in the series so far. But they just had to kill off every character that was supposed to stick around, and kept alive the characters that should have died years ago. After Carl's character was killed off, there was a pretty clear decline of the quality left in the show. It had been happening for a while, but at that point, characters were just being killed off for the sake of shock value, or to get rid of characters that people had grown attached to just to replace them with background characters that had the charisma of a fucking wet towel. It was also pretty obvious to all that once Rick and Michonne had left the show, there was no way it was going to be able to hold up. But you can't blame the actors for the show losing its former glory. You've actually got to blame the guy who decided that each season needed 16 episodes. If you aren't familiar with The Walking Dead, then let me say this. It was kind of like a CW/DC show. It dragged on for far too long and refused to end. The pacing was terrible, and of course there were far too many episodes. But a noticeable difference between the two is that The Walking Dead had a set comic book counterpart, one that they could have followed to a T, but things kind of went off the rails from the beginning of the first episode. Slight changes between comic book to live action were to be expected. In live action, there are some things that you just can't copy verbatim from the source material. And by switching things up, you can potentially, not all of the time, make things better. And funnily enough, I think The Walking Dead actually did that pretty well. I personally think the beginning of the show was done better in the comics, but most people are going to pick the show's counterpart anyway, simply because of Glenn, Daryl, and Shane. Those characters were done incredibly well in the first 2 seasons, and of course, Daryl wasn't even in the comics. You see, the origin point of this decline in quality is actually kind of a grey area. Those might say that the show only got shit in around season 7, but I'd say the shit just got a lot less tolerable around then. What made the show shit in the first place was the pacing and the length. And because of bad pacing, each season had its flaws. But because of the amount of episodes they had to film each year, the show kind of became the actors' whole lives. You can't blame any of these people for being so exhausted. You can't blame any of these people for being so exhausted on a show that I am going to assume went on for as long as it did just to make more money. I honestly don't know how accurate that is, but there's got to be some truth in there, right? Shows like The Flash and Arrow were amazing when I was a kid, but the second my brain turned from a smooth chicken breast brain to a wrinkly brain, I realized that these shows were just dragging out for way too long. 24 episodes was not needed to see The Flash get faster and beat the slightly faster bad guy. The Walking Dead chose to do 16 episodes per season, and I believe that format worked for a very brief amount of time. Like I said before, they had a bit of a hot streak with adding new scenes that weren't present in the comics. The show over time made more and more decisions that made it completely separate from the comics, even whilst following the same path. The prison arc in the show improved on a lot of different character arcs and had a much more impactful conclusion. The length of these episodes actually had a big part of making that work. Characters like Herschel and Tyrese were fleshed out more and became kind of unique to the show. There was just a lot of needless violence in the prison arc in the comics, and while I still preferred that version of the story, the show did come in clutch by cutting out some of that tasteless, inhumane shit that was with the governor. And if you've read the comics, you understand what I'm talking about. I'd say that the final episodes of the season were the only ones that were dragged out for too long, but that more so stems from a simple case of a mistake in the writing. Andrea was a terrible character in the show, more so because of how amazing she was in the comics. I think the role she played in the show was important and somewhat well done, but they just picked the wrong characters to do these things, and eventually they began to pay for these little mistakes. Season 6 is when the bad pacing began to outweigh the overall narrative. Looking back at the episode list now, I'm beginning to get flashbacks to when I watched these episodes live. I was so frustrated with the beginning of the episode being interesting, then they fooled around for the entire middle section, and then finally wrapped up what could have been done in 20 minutes in 40 minutes. The Jesus episode is a prime example of this, and the latter half of that season is even worse from the poor introduction of the Saviors. The Saviors' introduction was incredibly sloppy. We had some decent foreshadowing with Dwight, although it did take an entire episode just to give us that tidbit of information. We had about episodes 12 to 16 to give us Negan stuff, but it kind of just regurgitated the same shit we knew the whole time. 5 episodes straight of just bland enemies being mowed down, with the slightest bit of growth for a few main characters. It just could have been done in less than an episode, and it would have been a lot less boring. With season 6 out of the way, we might as well go over the Negan introduction. It was fun, but extremely flawed. They shouldn't have lazily killed off Glenn right after Abraham, as it undermined Abraham's death, and felt kind of forced. We know Glenn was only killed off because he was dead in the comics at that point, and we know that Abe was killed off because he was also dead at that point in the comics. So they just try to play catch up and kill them both. It's so lazy that it's actually a joke that they went through with it. I predicted that Abe would die first because I knew that they wanted to pull one out from under us and not kill Glenn straight away. I think killing Glenn straight away would have actually been more surprising, since it would have been one of the few times that they copied straight from the comics page for page. Also, I'm not just calling Glenn's death lazy because they killed 2 people in one episode. I'm saying it's lazy because right after Abraham died, they just had Daryl do something he wouldn't do, which triggered Negan into doing something that he shouldn't have done. If Daryl punches Negan, Negan should have taken that punishment on Daryl straight away and taken him away from the crew right then and there. It kind of reminds me of that scene in season 5 when Rick's entire crew is outnumbered by those bikers. Then the bikers threaten to kill Carl, Daryl, and Michonne in front of him. Rick then perked up and bit the guy's neck off, and he had a gun pointed at him too. It was a similar circumstance with Daryl and Negan because the entire group was surrounded. Thing is, when Rick made his risk, he made sure to fucking kill the guy. Daryl just smacked Negan across the face like it was a minor inconvenience, and then Negan fucking killed Glenn. It's actually hilarious that they did that, but it still pisses me off. Let's talk about what I consider the final straw, which was killing off Carl fucking Grimes. Now, this wasn't exactly my final straw, but it was more so that once I had realized that they were killing off these vital characters at the worst times, that, it just wasn't worth it anymore. Now, I don't know a lot about running a show or behind the scenes of things, but I know that a pretty big goal of theirs would be to keep the show from falling off. And I personally think that there's a couple of things they could have done to prevent that. First off, they could have taken a step back and dropped the episodes down to about 13 or so. If I were dedicated enough, I would rewatch every single episode and try to point out segments that were unnecessary, or scenes that eventually became redundant. I know that they're there, but to point them all out would be fucking draining. The next option they could have taken would be to simply change the release date for the show as a whole. In our modern day and age, shows aren't being released at the same time every year. Some of the biggest shows this year, Stranger Things and The Boys, both of these shows were released over a year after their previous season. The former might have been exceptionally longer than the latter, but my point still stands. A season of high quality television takes more than a year to make, in most cases. If the show were to switch up this style and mimic this format in the slightest, actors would have had enough time to spend with their families so they wouldn't have had to quit the fucking show. These shows that drop a new season every year typically have rushed scripts, since the writers aren't being paid enough or just don't have enough time to produce a quality script. My genuine hatred and complaints for this show begin here because, well, at this part of the show, it's just not worth watching. Seasons 9, 10, and 11. If you kept watching just to see the Whisperer War take place, then I wouldn't blame you. There's quite a few things that would be nice to see in live action, but if there's no Rick, there's no me in my seat paying attention to this damn show. Now, the biggest overarching flaw in the entire show has a lot to do with the showrunners, and the final few seasons that were terrible kind of stem from that problem as well. There were about 4 different showrunners for The Walking Dead, and the best one by far had to be the showrunner for the first season, Frank Darabont. He was fired before he could finish season 2, and what John Bernthal and Sarah Wayne Kelly said earlier in the year on their podcast, it seemed that letting him go was somewhat unjustified. Either way, Frank had left, and they had someone take over for a bit, and the show just got worse. Frank basically had the formula down right. He knew that he was going to change some things from the comics from the get-go. but he knew the changes he made was going to benefit the story in the show. I would have loved to see what kind of ideas he had for the seasons later on. Had he stayed on board, I'm sure that this would have been a very different kind of video. As for the other showrunners, there's only one that everybody should hate, and that's Scott Gimple, the guy who thought it'd be a good idea to kill off Carl fucking Grimes. You dumb fuck, you don't kill Carl Grimes, you fucking idiot. It was apparently because he needed to give Rick a reason to keep Negan around. What a fucking idiot. What a blind piece of shit. I swear Scott didn't even read the comics. Making that Carl's last wish is such a cop-out. As for the last showrunner who worked on seasons 9 through 11, I gotta show some respect. Trying to piece everything back together after Scott brutally fucked it up must have been so hard. At the same time, the irrelevant subplots that could have been avoided in the last few seasons are too notable. There has to be someone telling these people to go out of their way to put in the most boring dog shit ideas. They're just the most redundant scenes possible. I can't imagine that a showrunner would be that keen on nuking their own project. Honestly, it's a hard choice to say which was worse for the show. The number of episodes set by some higher up fuckhead in AMC, or the terrible showrunners. Either way, if they had switched up the pacing and the number of episodes, they'd definitely find it easier to stick to the source material. So I'd say that even with a shit showrunner, they'd manage to keep the show afloat with less episodes. But looking back on it, I don't know if I can even justify Scott Gimple. He pisses me the fuck off. I guess that's the good thing about shows these days though, because now everything is going to streaming. When a new show is out and people are talking about it, you just know that you'll watch it and that no one will talk about it for years until the next season comes out. I actually prefer weekly episodes over releasing the entire season at once, and I hope more shows stay away from that Netflix gimmick of dropping everything at once. If there's a silver lining here, it's to read the Walking Dead comics and forget about the show. The comics are great and you'll love it. Okay, bye.